Before I jump into covering this slide, so please, I mean, it's colorful, I know it's distracting, but focus your attention on thinking about, for just a minute, thinking about what we've covered so far. Do you have any concerns or doubts? Is there anything that we need to chat about before I cover techniques at a high level and introduce you to the idea and possibly show you some examples of some of them? Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry. This might be super simple, but I was wondering what mental maps,
Mind maps?
what is mental maps of VA activities? What does that mean? I was reading the preface and introduction, and I came across that.
In the Babok?
No. On the workbook, the study guide. I'm sorry.
On the study guide. Mental maps might be mind maps. Mental maps are not in the Babok.
Okay.
So,
okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I know what mind maps are. Thank you.
Wilson, it's a bit fast paced. Is it possible to go a little slower? We can. Today, so we have 4 hours to fit all of this in, and certification prep is often quite fast paced. If I go much slower, just being honest and clear, we will definitely go long each time. As it stands at the speed I go, I usually go 30 minutes long already. Don't feel like you have to grasp and understand everything the first round. You're not going to. There's so much information that we have to get to you in a little period of time to help you understand what to do to pass the test. This is not, I'm not expecting that you're going to be able to take this and actually execute all of it after this conversation. Now, with that being said, if I'm covering something and there's an element to it that's more complex, please stop me and say, you know what, this specific concept, can you give me a little more time on this one? I need to better understand. And if you're feeling like what I'm sharing with you is not helping, going slower with that won't necessarily change that. But what could help is if I tell you stories. So if I'm covering a content and you're like, wow, that was fast, I'm not really getting it, I'm not connecting those dots, stop me. This is not, there is no judgment here. Business analysis is complex. I remember my husband goes with me when I speak publicly, and he acts as videographer. And the first time he ever went with me and he heard me talk and he heard the questions I get and stuff like that, he was like, okay, so I talk about it when I get home, right? I talk about what I do. But when I talk about what we do as analysts in public and we're presenting, he's like, okay, now I get why you guys have a really hard time being leveraged correctly. Because what you guys do is fascinating, but not easy for most people to understand. So especially if you're a little new to the Babok and you're new to this idea in this world, don't let it intimidate you. Please speak up if there's a concept I'm covering and I'm going quickly for the sake of time. We're recording this, so if I need to give you a little more time on a specific area and we go long, we're going to just have to be okay with that. It's recorded. Everyone, if someone has to leave, they'll be able to, watch the video, and then the following weekend, they'll get a chance to ask any clarifying questions they had. So please feel free to speak up. Ask me to go slower on specific things. Just put it in the chat for me. Okay?
I have some suggestion for the people that are doing ECBA. I'm doing ECBA as well. I was thinking maybe we could do a study group. Just because everything is so new to us, it could help us. We can be additional resources for each other during the week between classes.
That's an excellent idea.
I'll look into that, of course.
So those of you that
Great.
are,
Let's find a way to convince Jennifer.
yeah, so those of you that are interested in joining a group, throw that in the chat. And if you wouldn't mind, dear, if you would identify those individuals and collaborate with them on getting a collaboration process down, that would be awesome. And remember, you will also get to have small 1-hour sessions with LN as you go as well.
Laura, can I ask one question? This is Jennifer Valentine.
You bet.
You've done it recently. Whenever we were going through the definitions or the key terms,
right,
you would give an example of the entry level quiz would look like versus the certified for the certification. Is it possible when we're going forward, you could kind of say, hey, entry level folks, this is probably what it would look like? That would help me hone into what I really need to look at.
Okay, now say that one more time, please. So
okay.
So not you were talking about the key terms.
When we're doing the key term, you gave an example of, hey guys, those doing the entry level, this is an example of what your quiz question would look like.
Right.
Could you do with the other items so we'll know how in depth we need to study that particular part, or if it's something we need to hone into?
You bet. Yeah, that's something. And then I usually wind up doing that a lot more when we hit the actual knowledge areas. So tomorrow you're going to get a lot more of that.
Okay, great.
And you'll also, when you start, after you read your study guide a little bit, go through this class, to go through the conversation today and tomorrow. So like tomorrow, I'll be covering planning and monitoring and elicitation and collaboration. Once I've covered that with you, ideally tonight you have a chance to review those two knowledge areas in your study guide, get a little bit familiar. That'll help you with the speed of class as if you read ahead. Then we have class. I cement with stories. I tell you my interpretation of it according to my experience with IBA and kind of like tie that into the exam. And then after that, before next weekend, you should have read the other 4 knowledge areas in the study guide, ideally. Expose yourself to the thinking and the ideas behind those knowledge areas before you get with LN. And also try to start executing your study plan for the knowledge areas we cover this weekend. And when you start hitting your quiz banks, the quiz banks will be very similar to the real thing. The experience will be very similar. The questions will be similar. Those of you that are U.S. resources that are really used to reading things in natural English, some of the questions might be hard to read because they're written from all over the world and converted to English. They're reviewed by a group of individuals that speak the common language of English, but one of the questions I got in my test was written from the perspective of a very different culture. And I could tell by the kind of question it was and the types of responses that were provided. I was not comfortable with any of the options provided. I was like, I'd never say any of these things. They're all rude. Sorry. So what I had to do was I had to think, okay, what culture is this being asked from? What perspective is this being asked from? What would the people be like that might receive this information? And that'll put me in the mind frame of, okay, so which of these options would be the most appropriate out of the group that I would be expecting to do, right? So sometimes you will get questions that multiple options in the answers are right. More than one right answer might be listed in your options for answering. It's a single selection that you're allowed to do. So what you have to do is you have to figure out what's the best option based on my understanding of the BABOK and what I was taught is the mindset of IIBA, right? So you'll want to think about that. Some of your questions will have more than one right answer. You have to pick the best answer. And it's not about what your experience is. It's about what the best practices are. Sometimes there's more than one possible answer. One of them is probably closer to what you experience in real world, but it's not ideal. The ideal one is the answer that the Babok is expecting you to give, IBA is. So you will get a lot of that experience in your test questions, your quizzes. You'll get a lot better understanding about that. I verbalize it here and there where it fits, like I'm about to do with some of this technique stuff that you're kind of looking at on the side. I'll tell you what to expect in the test for some of these things. I'll try to tell you guys ECBA versus CCBA versus CBAP, which ones are you most likely going to be impacted by? Because those of you in ECBA and CCBA, you're not going to get certain techniques presented to you because they're expected of people that have a lot more experience. So some of these techniques are painful. So yes, I will definitely give examples. We do cover a ton of information in the 4 hours we have allotted to us. I often go over, but if you need me to slow down on a specific area, just let me know. Any other questions before I start covering some of these techniques?
Yeah.
Yes.
Just two quick questions. So one is basically, when you said that before, it would be good if we actually read the topics that we're going to cover in the next class.
Right.
So mainly based on the study guide that we find in the portal, right? So
Yes.
when do we also look at the Babok guide? Is it along with that, or is it okay just to read the study guide?
I would not stop at the study guide. Before class, please read the study guide. Because the study guide is more consumable when you're new to the Babok. I do highly recommend you read the Babok before you get into a lot of your quizzes. At least, so you should have read the Babok before you hit the simulations. Worst case scenario, make sure you've read the Babok before you hit the simulations. Once you've done a once over on the Babok, and you don't need to memorize it, you don't need to be intimately comfortable with it, just make sure you've been exposed to it, because remember, your study guide is a very condensed version of it. So once you get it's layering the knowledge on. You don't want to fire hose it any more than we already are. So study guide, class, you can do some quizzes before you hit the simulator. Read the Babok, all but you don't have to read the perspectives. You only have to read the knowledge areas and techniques. That's it. But just again, once over it, when you're going through your quizzes, if you miss questions, the quiz is going to let you know, hey, you missed this. This is the thought process behind it. If the guidance that Ellen has built into those systems and you're reading, you got one wrong and you're reading the explanation and you're like, I just don't get it, refer to the Babok about that. Okay? Yeah, so you'll pick at it while you're going through your quizzes, but before you hit your exam simulators, I recommend you have read the Babok, I think it's the first half of it, because I think the second half is all about perspective and you won't be tested on that at all. Okay? Okay.
Yeah. And just one more thing. So basically, you said that these 6 knowledge areas, right?
Yes.
There's no specific sequence or order that you follow.
Correct.
When we perform business analysis. But say, for example, there's an absolutely fresh proposition that's being brought in.
Okay.
So of these, what would be the first one that you would pretty much tend to target at? To look at first? Would it be strategy analysis or?
Well, the very, very first thing you wind up doing is eliciting. Because you're trying to understand what question is being asked of me.
Okay.
So what is being asked of me, and then you would go to planning and monitoring, because once you've talked to someone, that very first conversation, that's elicitation. So once you've gone to that conversation and you have a better idea about what you're dealing with, now you're going to plan activities to do full elicitation. to really understand. Now, when I'm doing elicitation for that very first part of a change, if I've been lucky enough to be pulled in when someone first says, hey, we need a change, ideally I get to do strategy analysis. If you're a younger business analyst, that's probably already done, and your involvement is helping with the detail and documenting requirements and making sure it gets implemented well, right? But the more experienced you are, ideally you have a chance to do strategy. While you're doing strategy, you're still eliciting and collaborating. Elicitation and collaboration lays on top of most of these techniques. Then you'll do strategy analysis. When you get about 3/4 of the way through strategy, at that point you understand where we are, where we're going, and what the gaps are and what the risks are. And you've started to ask yourself, okay, great, how are we going to solve for this? To do that, I'm going to start defining high-level requirements. Now I jump down into requirements analysis and design before I'm done with strategy. And I define requirements at a higher level. I model things at a higher level. I do like scope models. I do context diagrams. I do business requirements. I do that level, right? High-level features and function discussions, not the details. And once I've done that, I start identifying what are the ways that we can solve for this. So I'm going to point to this while I'm talking, okay? So the very first thing that happens is I start doing elicitation, all right? I'm probably having individual interviews. Someone comes up to me and says, hey, sorry, your question leads well into this. Let me answer that in just a minute. I need to look at a couple of these questions really quick. And then...
Sorry, I must have... but yeah, I just want to ask you that question, sorry.
No, you're fine. But that leads perfectly into what I'm about to cover. And I almost just went straight into it and realized I think I have failed a few of you. Hold on just one second. How do I know which terms are necessary for ECBA from Babok? Understanding the terms is really, really good. And this right here is only techniques. This is not your terms. So your flashcards will help you memorize the most important terms. You as an ECBA will not be asked questions on some of these techniques. For example, sequence diagrams. An ECBA will not be asked about that at all. CCBA will very, very unlikely be asked anything about sequence diagrams. They are a much more technical technique. CBAP, most of the time, doesn't get a question on this. However, I have had 2 students get a question on this and it stumped them. They knew they got it wrong. But ECBA and CCBA won't. ECBA definitely won't have sequence diagram questions. CCBA most likely won't have sequence diagram questions. Okay, so as we move through the techniques, I'll let you guys know if it's all levels, I'll say CCBA. If it's CCBA, I'll say ECBA. If it's CCBA and up, I'll say CCBA. If it's CBAP only, I'll say this is only CBAP. Okay, so when we're going through this. The rest of our class is going to be on this single slide. But I am going to, on some of these that have actual examples that are deliverables that you give, I'll pull that up online. Okay, so I hope that answers your question, Moon. And Gerald, yes, you've got multiple people doing CBAP. I think you've got like 5 or 6 people doing CBAP in this class. Okay, with that being said, let's talk about, I'm going to talk to you about this slide with the typical flow that you would probably experience if you were lucky enough to get involved from the beginning. And that would be most of the CBAPs. I'll call out when it's strategy work we're talking about. I know that these techniques are lumped into these groups. This is only for you to absorb it and kind of be aware of how these are most likely used. However, it's not one-to-one. Most of these techniques live in more than one knowledge area. So don't memorize this slide, please. That will do you a disservice. This is just for us to talk and have a good understanding of, it helps us talk about it. It helps you absorb it and stuff like that, okay? I'm going to show you a couple of other things before we adjourn today that will help you study, because tomorrow we will not have time, okay? All right. So the very first thing that happens is someone comes up to you and says, hey, we've got a problem or opportunity. We sure could use your help. Well, now I'm in the elicitation area and I'm having an individual interview conversation. If it's a back and forth conversation, I'm interviewing. And I'm like, okay, great. So I try to figure out just some basics. So what department is it? What's the main pain point? What does that mean to you? Okay, we probably need to get some people together to kick this off and make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. Okay, great. So they tell you some things about, they say, okay, well, this is primarily, I'm going to use the example of that claims thing, right? Had someone come to me and say, we're losing customers. Why? Well, because our competitor processes claims 5 times faster than we do. Well, that sucks. That's not good. Okay, so let's see. So we're talking about claims. Obviously, I need the claims department, but what else? Well, the salespeople need to probably be involved because they talk to the clients all the time. Okay, great. So we have that conversation. I dig out of them some information that gets me started. Now I go over to planning. And I'm probably looking at some organizational models. I'm looking at the breakdown of the organization, trying to find out who works in what areas, who are the leaders. Hopefully I have a little bit of awareness of the politics. I start figuring out who are the stakeholders I need to talk to. Now, I'll often make sure, I'll use a stakeholder map to figure some of this out. Okay, so stakeholder onion diagram. Okay, so I will often use something like this. This is a stakeholder map in a specific form of an onion diagram. What this does for me is it helps me make sure I'm thinking holistically about who I need to talk to. So I start with we're trying to change claims. Okay, great. Well, obviously, I'm going to need to think about what technology resources are involved in the claims we have today. I'm going to think about who out of them should I talk to understand the capabilities of our systems. Okay, who are the people that are engaged in it? This is like, who are the users? Who trains people? Stuff like that. Who are the middle level of user that interact directly with the system or support the people that do? I think about that level. I think about who are their leaders? What are their expectations of the people that process claims? How do I need to engage them? And then I think about the outlier. How is this impacting our customers? What experience do they have when they're submitting claims, when they're receiving their checks, when they're all kinds of stuff like that? When they receive questions, how do we communicate with them? Understanding from their perspective, understanding the regulatory compliance requirements. There are certain things we're talking about insurance, highly regulated. I got to make sure I'm thinking about that when I'm trying to figure out what do we need to do to process claims faster. How are our competitors? Well, we specifically said that we're losing people to our competitor. Why? What does that look like? So understanding that using the onion diagram. So that's a stakeholder. Hold on. Oh, come on. Okay. That's a stakeholder map. Okay. So I'm looking at the organizational model, leveraging the map, and starting to make a list of the people I need to talk to. Once I've done that and I'm like, okay, I'm in strategy analysis, I'm going to need to put together a strategy analysis workshop. Okay, great. Well,
Laura.
Yes.
Yes. Are you experiencing lag time? I hate to interrupt.
Am I doing what?
Or is it just me? Is anyone else experiencing lag time? I'm just seeing like where you Googled something, but I don't see anything else.
You don't.
Okay, now it's back to the text.
You don't see this off to the right? This onion diagram?
No, I just see the techniques mind map.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're having some lag.
Okay. Let me sign out.
Okay. Now keep in mind, you will also be able to watch the video later. If you're having that kind of lag, while I'm talking, you might have a Google image section open. And when I say onion diagram, stakeholder onion diagram, you can look up stakeholder onion diagram. But if you're having a lag with the video and stuff, it might exacerbate the problem. I don't know. Okay. Let me go back to this. All right. So you have the map. Can you see where I'm pointing at least? Can you guys see my cursors?
Yes.
Okay, good. Good.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So using
Yes.
that map.
I'm gonna come back in.
Okay, good.
Yes.
So I'm looking at that map, making sure I'm thinking about all the people. And then I'm thinking about how am I going to get the right kind of information from these people in a way that they will work together. So I got to understand certain types of personalities that are going to be in the room, because I can approach a workshop so many different ways. So many different ways. So if I've got, no offense to anybody on the line, but if I've got a typical group of accountants or lawyers or something like that, I'm probably not going to bring in some silly games, right? I'm gonna bring in games because I got to make it fun because change is scary. But I need to understand, what are the people coming in the room? What do they care about? Are they a bunch of introverts or are they extroverts? If I have a combination, I don't want the extroverts to control the room. I want the introverts to have a voice. So what's my plan going to be to deal with that? I might build out some personas. Now, when I get further into my project, I'm going to come back to personas when I'm doing my requirements analysis and design. But for now, we're just talking about, I'm trying to understand people. So I understand people. Now I go back into group-based workshops and I start kicking that off. Now, if I'm not sure where to start, I might start my workshop with a bit of brainstorming to at least put some level of structure around the chaos, right? So brainstorming, I'll start to do some brainstorming, and that's where we're just like throwing out ideas along a specific theme, no judgment, nothing like that. Usually I start with workshops because I'm just trying to understand strategy. Now, if I'm trying to understand strategy about what a customer cares about, then I'm going to do a focus group instead. So when I'm taking that original interview and understanding the challenge at hand, and I'm understanding the people in the organizational model, and I'm starting to think about what am I trying to accomplish, I'm going to have to figure out what group-based thing am I going to do. Collaborative games can apply to every other group-based collaboration. But focus groups is a lot more about how do you feel about something. This is where you have like Pepsi brings you into a room and they have 5 different cans in front of you with completely different designs, and they ask you, how do you feel about each one of these? And then they take that kind of information across a multitude of individuals and they figure out which can incites interest more than others, and that's going to be their new design. A focus group can also be a very structured conversation that is free. I know structured and free don't go together well, but you bring a group of people into a room and you start saying stuff like, okay, so you say, let's discuss a challenge about X. And so people start talking. You only engage in that focus group when it looks like it's starting to deviate from the purpose, and then you ask questions or you gently steer people back to the conversation that we need to have, but you don't interfere. Focus groups are supposed to be largely about the people in it running it in a way. You're there to facilitate, but the conversation in itself drives it. Collaborative games are things that you can do to make elicitation more engaging and less scary. There's a ton of it out there. On a side note, something that I think is super cool. I think you guys should check this out. That's for GameStorm. That's for a lot of, that's for the collaborative games. There are so many really cool techniques in here. And a lot of those aren't in the bad box. So that's just a side note, not about your test, but it's a really cool tool to get some collaborative games. In IIBA, all of those are just collaborative games. There are so many elicitation techniques that are about games that they are not even going to begin to test you on it. Just know what collaborative games are. Throughout the next few sessions, you're going to be introduced in more depth to these. I'm going to go ahead and get it set up so that you have exposure to it before we start covering it tomorrow. Just so that you have exposure to it and it's already in your head. And I've been told that it makes it a lot easier for you to consume the conversations with techniques later. Okay, so I've had that group conversation. I've got some good information out of it. Hopefully, in the process of that strategy workshop, I have uncovered where we are today, all those process models. I've had people derive out of that information the crack. What do we keep, remove, add, change? Which helped me say, okay, well, what I'm hearing is we want to get to this, right? So we talk about the future. Hopefully in that situation, we've got those two. Now I'm going to step away and I'm going to start identifying the gaps. So I'm going to start doing some capability analysis right? So I've started doing some process modeling. I know that's over here, but process modeling is part of current state. So I actually hit process modeling in strategy analysis. I start doing my process modeling and strategy analysis. I start doing some, let's see, where is it? Sorry, I don't usually cover this slide. I start doing some functional decomposition. So I'll look at the organizational model and functional decomp to help me build out my stakeholder list, but I'll do functional decomposition down here. I'll redo it based on new understanding. So I'll flip back over to functional decomposition while I'm doing strategy analysis, and I'll do functional decomp, I'll do current state process models, I'll do future state process models. I'll start looking at that functional decomposition compared to where we are versus where we want to go. I start doing some scope modeling here. I start doing some high level user stories here. I actually do those user stories in the form of business requirements. I start writing my high level business requirements while I'm in strategy analysis, although it's kind of like requirements analysis. So I do that gap while I'm there. And then I move over to requirements analysis where I start writing my high level business requirements and stuff. And once I've started doing that, now I start saying, okay, I've done in strategy analysis, I've kind of broken down the business capability. And business capability analysis, that's one. Let me show you a couple of these things that I just mentioned. There's nothing to show you on this. This doesn't have a deliverable. But I did say functional decomposition. So let's go over here and let me show you a functional decomp. Functional decomp is where we have a function and we break it down into other activities, and then we break those down into other activities. So functional decomp can be functions in an organization, or it can be systems. This specifically is a system function decomp. IRMA is a solution, and it has the ability to plan, execute, monitor, control, and do information management. For planning, it has the ability it has capabilities of mobile forecaster and trip planner. For execution, it has the ability to manage tickets and to have feed collector. So this system is broken down into these capabilities, which are then further broken down into other capabilities. Okay, let's try to find. I'm trying to find, like, hold on. Okay, this is a functional decomposition, but not perfect. Because this is a role name, and functional decompositions aren't supposed to talk about role names. They're supposed to talk about functions. And so administration, greeting process, billing process, that's what these should say. And in administration, office administration, we would say maintain system, register staff, maintain staff information, register rooms. It would have those. And then to be able to register staff, does that have further functions that person has to, or capabilities that person has to have? So that's functional decomposition. Okay. So once I do that, that helps me wrap my head around the functions in the organization that are impacted by this thing that was brought to me as a challenge. So at this point, I've had my first conversation. I've figured out based on my map, looking at the organizational model, who are my stakeholders, maybe built out a few personas of typical personality types based on that stakeholder list. Tried my hand at a scope model. So let me show you a scope model, because I don't know a lot yet, right? So a scope model is really high level. It usually looks something more like this. This is a good scope model idea. Here's a scope model. Now, when it comes to your Babok, let me show you your Babok when it comes to, let me pull this over here too. Come on. That's not what I want. Okay. Scope models usually, so if you want to know how you're going to be tested on that, they actually don't have an example of a scope model. That's interesting. Okay. So every one of your techniques is going to have a purpose. All of you need to know the purpose of the techniques. Some of you will need to know CBAP and CCBA will have to know how to read scope models. Let me go do this for these others. So for interviews, every level, understand what it is, understand what its purpose is and strengths and weaknesses. Stakeholder list maps and personas, everyone. Understand that ECBA does not have to know how to read the deliverables. Like if they give, CCBA and CBAP are going to be given, hey, here's a stakeholder map. Which layer of this map is the layer you would want to investigate given the specific scenario presented, right? You'll get those kind of questions. ECBA will just be asked, what is a stakeholder map? That's it. You're not going to be asked to be able to read it, understand it, extract information from it to answer a question. Scope models, that's for all of you. Organizational models, I think most of you have seen an org chart probably. That should be pretty self-explanatory. Functional decomposition, a little less ECBA, but the others will definitely want to be able to understand what that is. And CCBA and CBAP will need to know how to read it. So then we talk about, okay, then I moved down into strategy analysis and I started talking about, okay, now that I know who I'm talking to, what I'm trying to accomplish, and I figured out who my stakeholders are, and I've broken down some things into organizational people structure and function structure so I know how to ask my questions and how to structure my conversation. Now I start doing my process modeling. Process modeling is all levels. ECBA only needs to understand it. CCBA, CBAP need to know how to read it and understand it and extract requirements from it. Now, the best process model function to understand is BPMN. BPMN is the international, it's the most widely used standard for understanding and documenting processes, and it looks something like this. ECBA, you only need to know what process modeling is about, what's its purpose, what are the strengths and weaknesses, but the others on the call need to understand how to be able to translate a process model and pull requirements out of it. Okay, so be aware of that. BPMN 2.0, if you're not familiar with it, it would be ideal for you to become familiar with it as an analyst. So I'm processing out current state, probably taking a stab at future state, looking at the difference between them. Now I have a gap to consider, and now I have to start understanding what does that gap mean to me? So I probably want to understand, and this is more CBAP, business capability analysis, because this is a true strategy function. Business capability analysis usually results in a map. These maps just break down the functions in the organization. Now, for the business capability map to be actually useful, it needs to tell you something about that function, meaning how well it is functioning. Where is my favorite example? It's the one that Adaptive uses. It's my favorite example, but it's not on this slide deck. So usually you use business capability maps with a form of a heat map in order to understand. Here's one that will work. So these that are in red usually means danger, Will Robinson. You have risk here. It usually means that the solution, something about that is not functioning as well as it could. Maybe if I change it to that, will I get what I want? The best tools have multiple layers of the business capability modeling And what it does is it has a little, it's color coded in multiple levels. So I'm just going to ask you to use your imagination. I'm going to just pull up one of these and, oh shoot, I don't know why I'm not getting what I want. Okay, so it would take one of these, and each one of these boxes will have a little circle in the upper right corner, and there are 3 layers of color. There are two borders, and they're color coded. The outer border is the customer value. How valuable is this to the customer? If it's red, it's really high value. If it's moderately, it's yellow, and if it's low value, it's green. Okay, and then you'll have the next layer, and it says, okay, what is the value to our organization? And that has the same kind of color coding. And then the function itself will have color coding, and it will be, how well is this performing? So if it's high value to the business, high value to the customer, and it's performing poorly, you're going to have red on all 3 layers. And what that means is that is at risk. We have to fix that. And that means that you would have a yellow dot, and that means a red dot, and that means everything would be red. And that tells you easily at a glance, it helps you communicate why we need to address something that we need to address. So that's business capability analysis. It's where we look at the functions of the organization, both people, technology, and process, and we ask ourselves, what are the capabilities there? How well are they performing? And what needs to be addressed based on what we're dealing with. So we've got business capability analysis. If we're doing strategy to help a business decide on product direction or what do we want to do, and that's going to be business model canvas. A business model canvas, I'm going to fly through these because you're going to cover them again. Business model canvases help you think about what a business needs in order to accomplish a goal. And so it drives you through thinking about what's the value we're talking about. Okay, based on this value, what are the customer segments we're trying to present that value to? What kind of relationships do we want to build with each of those customers? What kind of channels do we communicate with those different relationships? How do we make sure that we're doing that well? And then the other side of the coin, to build out this value proposition, what are the activities that are necessary? What resources do we need to perform those activities? Who do we work with? And then for everything, what's the cost and revenue? Now that really only works when you're trying to do it. Its intended function is to help organizations strategize their big picture, but it can also be used to solve a problem. So when you've got a problem presented to you and you're having a hard time wrapping your head around all of the elements you need to consider, the value proposition is, with the problem or opportunity that was brought to you, what's the value proposition? And then you drive out the customers and the activities. And your customers might just be your internal claims people, or it could be the actual policyholder, right? So you can use business model canvases to do that, but that's still a strategy function because I'm trying to wrap my head around what we're trying to accomplish. And that helps me make sure I know what I'm working on and how to most effectively get there. So let's say that I've done all of that, and I've done the high level requirements with user stories and requirements. I don't even see actual requirements in here. So because it's not an actual technique. So at that point, now I start analyzing what are my options to solve for this, right? Now, before I do most of this, I'm going to think about, I need to be on the same page with what I'm calling things as everyone else, right? So we want a glossary. Pretty sure most of you know what a glossary is. All of you need to understand that. Business model canvas is a lot more CBAP, okay? With the glossary, we also need to have a way that we track issues, problems with requirements, problems with validating the need, risks that we have identified. All kinds of things need to be able to be tracked. And when I'm going through and I'm trying to figure out how to approach this, I might ask myself, have we done this before? I might go look at previous lessons learned so that when I'm planning out my workshop using that list and organizational model, I can say, have I tried something before that just bombed? Don't want to do that again, right? So I'll use my lessons learned. Okay, so at this point, I've covered interviews. I've talked about all the group-based. I've talked to everything over here except for estimation and interface analysis. We're not there yet. These things down here will happen in a little bit. So I have done that. Now I'm looking at the different solution options, right? Now my acceptance and evaluation criteria, when I'm starting to look at my solution options, that probably means I'm looking at vendor solutions and stuff like that. And I'm looking at it from the perspective of what are we saying would make a solution acceptable? And I'm measuring those solution options against that. I'm evaluating those solution options against that. This is often derived from those business requirements. Okay, that's usually your acceptance evaluation criteria. This is also part of user story function. Acceptance and evaluation criteria, they're really just requirements, but kind of lumped together when you're talking Agile. But acceptance and evaluation criteria, according to the Babok, is more than just Agile. It's how do you decide that the solution is good to go? That's your acceptance and evaluation criteria, okay? And there's no example I can show you on the images. Okay, so I've had these conversations. I've done some process modeling with current state, future state. I kind of started looking at the gaps, and I've identified some solution options. While I'm identifying solution options, I start hitting my estimation activity. That's where I'm trying to estimate the value. So I'm estimating cost and I'm estimating benefit so that I can come up with some things that we can actually communicate out to help people understand their decisioning process. You know, what's going to give me my most value? Now, when I've done my process modeling, I'm looking at current and future and I'm figuring out the gap. I probably am doing a little bit of analysis of the process itself and asking myself, where should we go with this? If this isn't working, what should it look like? So I'm starting to analyze that, probably getting some good requirements out of it. Process analysis is a technique that doesn't have a deliverable necessarily. It's just a function you perform, okay? Usually you take current state of process modeling, analyze it to find the gaps, do future state process modeling to help you come up with a decision. So I've done some things like that, right? I've done my current and future state process models with a little bit of process analysis. I have done some high-level requirements. I'm not anywhere near non-functional or business rules yet. I'm high-level requirements. Might have done a business model canvas and stuff like that. Now, when I start estimating cost and benefit, I'm starting to fill out my financial analysis. I'm starting to say, okay, what is the financial value to the organization for any one of these approaches we could take to solve this problem? So I'll do that. I'm also in strategy analysis. When I said I'm looking at current versus future and I've got my gaps, I start evaluating those three things together for risk. Start asking myself, what happens if we don't change? What happens if we do? What if this solution option doesn't do everything we said it should do and it's the one that we think we want to do? So I start doing all kinds of risk analysis. Also early on, when I'm looking at all of this and I'm starting to get an understanding, I might have a whole workshop on just SWOT. SWOT is strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threats. And so with SWOT analysis, there is a deliverable that you can do. So SWOT analysis template, you can do it multiple ways. Some tools have it built in, but while you're talking about, you have a specific thing in mind that you're analyzing for SWOT. And then you'll start talking to the group about what strengths do we have with processing our claims? What are our weaknesses? So our strengths would be stuff like, well, we've got really qualified people. Our products are unique and are specific to our customer segments. That's a strength. Our strength is that we are flexible with our customers. And our strength is that we approve the majority of our claims. We keep our clients whole. What are our weaknesses? Well, we don't automate much, so we're pretty slow in our process. We are not keeping up with technology, and we have when I did my functional decomposition and I was doing my process modeling and analysis, I recognized that I have 6 different claims departments that are doing claims quite differently. So there's no and the workload is varying throughout the year, and I have people sitting twiddling their thumbs while other people are struggling to survive. So I don't have anything centralized, but I can't because one of my weaknesses is inconsistent processing. I have siloed claims departments. Claims processing, for the most part, is claims processing. The only time I need to worry about specific or specialization or differentiation is if I've got a complicated claim that that's not really clear. Then I need to send it to someone that specializes in that vertical, right? So I'm realizing that I have a weakness from my structure, from my systems, from my speed of delivery, and I don't have very little automation. Those are my weaknesses. What are my opportunities? Well, I have opportunities to process claims faster so that we can keep our customers even happier. And our main threat is that our competitor processes claims almost 5 times faster. That's a big threat. So when you're doing SWOT, you're looking at all that and helping the organization focus on what they should really focus on. Again, that's a strategy thing. Very seldom, I don't think ECBA is going to have many questions on that. The most question you would have is what's the purpose of it? That's it. You wouldn't have to understand it a lot. I would expect, even though it's strategy analysis, I would expect CCBA would need to know that one too. Obviously, CBAP, just a given. You got to know all of it. All of it. And then the other thing in that strategy section is decision analysis. And that's where you are trying to, there's one more in there, but I'm not there yet. Decision analysis is where I might model out the decisions that people have to make in order to decide which solution option we're going to go for. So I'm going to say a decision analysis example. So there are several different ways that you can do decision analysis. There are trees. Here's a decision tree. Here's a decision tree. There are matrices. Here are your decision matrices. And then there's actual decision modeling. It's a pretty new thing. It blends both of those together. And those are not it. Hold on. I mean, those are a form of it, but most of those look really messy. There's DMN. I'm going to do that. Okay. This is DMN. I showed you an example of a business process model. Decision modeling integrates with it. Everywhere you see a diamond on a business process model, the preceding step is always a decision. Most of us don't document that because most of us don't do DMN. But if you really want robust information to help people make decisions and the kind of information necessary if you're going to automate decisioning in your organization, DMN is the way to go, because DMN will take your decision trees with your tables and integrate it all into a model form that integrates with your business process. So that's just another kind of cool thing on the side. Don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, but those of you that are CBAP, you might want to look into that. Okay, so I've done all of that. And I have started based on what would mean a good solution. I've got my high-level requirements. I've got my current and future state. That's not the same thing as this. I'll get there. And then now I'm ready to build out a business case. And this is what we do. So I've gone from elicitation and collaboration over into planning and monitoring to figure out what the heck I'm dealing with, back into elicitation to have some workshops and some group-based conversations to figure out where are we, where do we want to go, what's missing. Once I do that with people, now I go off to the side and I do a lot of these that I just mentioned to figure out what are we looking at. And I dip into RAD and solution evaluation to be able to figure that out. And then I come back into strategy analysis and I help them with financial and decision analysis information. I help them make a choice. So now we say that they've made a choice. Now, one thing I forgot to say, the prioritization. When I have those high-level business requirements, now I have to prioritize them. Because when I am evaluating solutions to meet that need, and I'm using this acceptance and evaluation criteria, this represents requirements. I need to know which ones are most important. Okay? Which ones are most important, because I'm going to do, in my decision analysis, I'm going to do some weighted matrices to help me give a score to all of the options. And the one that has the best score wins. Not always. Hopefully, but not always. Okay, so I've talked about glossary. I've talked about lessons learned. I've talked about prioritizing. You're going to learn a lot more about that later. And I've talked about item tracking. I've talked about functional decomp, estimation. We're not ready for this yet. And I've talked about these three. We've talked about all of this. Okay, so now we're at a point where we're ready to do more detailed work. So we've done our strategy work. We've said this is the strategy. This is where we are, where we're going to go. These are the gaps. Therefore, these are the requirements for a solution, high level. And I've helped them pick one. Okay, now I get into the detailed work. Now I start going back into elicitation, but only for the most important requirements. What are the requirements we can fulfill with our first implementation of this solution that we've defined in strategy? Okay, so I take a backlog. I take those first set of requirements that we measured these solutions against, high-level requirements, and they go into a backlog that is prioritized. And with that backlog that's prioritized, I figure out of these prioritized backlog, which of these top items must go all together for us to be able to implement a minimum viable product for us to be able to use. And I'll start doing that. And most organizations do that now. So I start working with my backlog and I start breaking those items down into more detailed requirements. And ideally, I know a lot of agile environments don't like this very much, but if it's a complex thing, I'm doing use cases, I'm doing process models, I'm doing ERDs, I'm doing all of that stuff if it's necessary. So I have this backlog. I've pulled out the requirements that are necessary. I do some more elicitation and collaboration, but I do it more focused. Now I'm more micro instead of macro. Strategy, macro. Execution and implementation iterations, micro. Okay, so when I get into the detail, I'm going to do more of these. Probably going to revisit some of these in planning. But now, before I start getting people involved, I'm going to say, okay, so we've decided that we need to do this minimum stuff. Okay, I need to see what the current policies and procedures are. I'm going to do some document analysis. I need to know what are the detailed current benchmarks I need to understand what our customers doing. Actually, customer market analysis usually falls in with strategy. Usually I'll do market analysis. I'm going to take you a step back to understand what are our customers wanting. And I'm going to start building out capability analysis and understanding some things about that first. And benchmarking is when I'm asking, okay, well, we've got this current claims management process. What do other people do? Now I'm digging into detail. What are this primary competitor that's processing claims in one day? Why can they do that? I'm going to benchmark myself against them and see what's the difference if I can get access to that information. So document analysis is very individual. It's you alone. And this is all levels need to understand this. Benchmarking and market analysis is usually more advanced. So usually benchmarking and market analysis will be mostly CCBA and CBAP. So I'm starting to understand a little more detail now. And now I go back into some of my user stories and process modeling, but I do it at a deeper level. I'm not so high level anymore. And now I start getting out the details. Okay, so now I start understanding when I'm looking at those policies and procedures in the documents, I'm reading those documents, I'm extracting now my business rules. Business rules tell me what are the boundaries within which I can do this stuff, right? Business rules also can help me understand who is allowed to do what. Pardon me. So when I'm doing the current state at a more micro level, again, I'm doing process analysis, but now I'm digging into the deep stuff. So I might do some root cause work. What is, for this specific thing, what is the root cause of this problem? Now, I might do root cause in strategy, but it's at a higher level. When I get into requirements analysis and design for detail, it's at a deeper level. So strategy involves a lot of this right here, requirements analysis and solution evaluation, but at a high level, really high level. When I get into my iterative detail of managing my backlog, now I get deeper. So at this point, I'm starting to build out some metrics and KPIs that I can measure the success of each iteration with and the long term, right? So when you're very first defining your business requirements that you are using to do all of the strategy work, you'll probably have some metrics and KPIs. I said, we want to maintain a customer retention rate of 90%. Well, that's a KPI metric for me to say, are we successful, right? But now I'm going to start doing a lot more right here. At this point, I have talked with people, I've done workshop groups, I've done almost everything in planning. I've done a lot in lifecycle management. So now I'm starting to dig into the details, and I start getting out detailed user stories or stakeholder requirements. I start understanding what that looks like. Now I also need to understand what my data looks like, right? So I start asking myself, usually starting with a glossary, I start digging into the data dictionary stuff. Data dictionaries are detailed elements about entities. So this is where we say, what is a customer? And we say, well, a customer has these attributes. Let's see. So here's a driver. Here's an entity of a driver. Okay, well, a driver has a license ID, a surname, a first name and address, a phone number, and a date of birth. So the driver is the entity, and these are the data elements for the entity and others supporting metadata about it. So that's a data dictionary. That helps us understand the data we're trying to work with. But let's say we're talking claims, right? My policyholder is going to have first, middle, last, a social security number, age, all kinds of stuff that's specific to that person, right? But they're also going to have policies. What does a policy have? A policy has a policy effective date, a policy end date, a policy premium, policy coverage, stuff like that. And then I'll have claims. Well, I know I've got those in my data dictionary. Now I need to model how they're connected. Your technology resources will need to understand how they're connected. And there are two kinds of data modeling. There's ERD, which is what most people use that I've ever worked with. And this is where you say, here's our claims holder, here's a policy, here are the claims. And with the claims, you can have who were the physicians and what were the services, right? So that's how you're showing how this information relates. You can help people understand can a customer have more than one policy? Can a policy have more than one claim? Stuff like that, right? So I start showing how it all connects. Now I might want to show how it flows through the systems. I'm going to look at data flow diagrams and interface analysis. At this point, I need to know what systems touch what systems and how. And then I also want to know how the data flows through them. So I've looked at dictionaries, modeling, and now I'm going to do a data flow diagram. So here's my data flow diagram stuff. This is where I show how data flows through a system, right? My patient is going to provide the system its name, and then the system's going to find a patient. And so you're going to see people have a specific structure, processes look a certain way, data stores look a certain way, and it shows how data flows back and forth through that, okay? Now, I understand my data. I understand the processes my people are having to work through. I might actually want to understand the state transitions for that data. For example, a claim is submitted, and then it can go into a state of rejected or approved or pending underwriting. From pending underwriting, it can go to approved or rejected. So you show those different states and which states can move to which states. It doesn't necessarily tell you the conditions the data requires to be in for it to move from state to state. It's just supposed to help you understand the different states that it can go through. To understand the different states it can go through when or what the parameters are, now you're looking at decision modeling, business rules analysis, and process modeling mixed with your state modeling, okay? State and decision, those are a little bit more advanced. I would say ECBA needs to know what they are and what their purpose is, but they don't need to know a lot other than that. CCBA and CBAP do. All right, so I understand my data, and I'm going to assume technology right now because technology projects involve everything, or they should. Process efforts may not touch technology at all. So we're going to talk about technology. We're going to assume technology because we're talking about data and stuff like that. Well, now I've got the process. I understand what my users want. I understand where the core problems are and stuff like that. Oh, and earlier I'm sorry, I forgot this one. When I was talking about decision analysis and evaluating solutions to meet the need, and I was you mix acceptance and evaluation with vendor assessment, just as part of that. Okay. Now, if your head's not already blown up, while I'm doing all of this, again, I keep these in mind, my business rules. But while I'm doing this, I'm starting to define my functional requirements that are necessary in order to move this data through things and understand what users need to be able to do with it. Now I'm starting to, and then I can start building in my non-functionals to ensure that I'm understanding my data in a way that my non-functionals are possible. And then I'm going to start doing some prototyping. I'm going to start throwing together, if it's just a business process, I'm going to throw together a future state process model in detail and show it to people. Most of the time when we say prototyping, people think user interface for tech, right? So you're going to do some screen mock-ups or build an actual functional prototype. And then you're going to start doing reviews with people to show them, hey, based on all of these processes and data and all this stuff that we looked at, this is what I think your solution should look like. What do you think? Right? So we start doing reviews. Now, and we've got, that's interesting, we've got business rules analysis in both spots. I think it should live more down here. Okay, anyway, so once we get to that point, now we are starting to also, once we're cool with that, while we're talking to them in reviews, usually we start uncovering who can click what buttons and who can fill in what fields and who can see what things, right? Okay. And then we get through the process where we finish the review, everything's good to go. Now it goes into actual development or implementation activities, and you continue to revisit any one of these things all the time if anything comes up that requires digging again. And then we repeat it. We rinse and repeat over and over and over until we've hit the value level that we want. Now let me go through all of these and make sure that I've shown you what I can. Prototyping, I don't know how many of you have seen screen mock-ups. That should be pretty straightforward. I'm going to cover some things that we did not cover yet. Interface analysis, there's no deliverable work product for me to show you. You've seen an organizational model. Personas, I didn't show you personas. Let me show you that real quick. A persona is where you imagine a real or made up customer, and then you start understanding what makes them who they are. What's their bio? What are their motivators? What are their goals and frustrations, and how do they behave? This helps you know how to interact and helps you get in their head to understand what they need. So that's personas. We've talked about those and that and this. We've talked about all those. Vendor assessment, I didn't talk a lot about that. Vendor assessment is where you don't just look at the vendor's software. You look at all kinds of stuff about them. How reliable are they? Do they have a good reputation? Are they stable, right? Are they going to be in business in a few years? What do their financials look like? How does their culture match ours? If we're going to have to work a lot with them, do they engage in a way that will make our organization comfortable, and will they accept them? We talked about these other things. Root cause analysis, you can do things like fishbone diagrams. I don't know how many of you have seen a fishbone diagram, but a fishbone diagram is where you say, here's my problem. What are the things that feed that? And then I look at all those things that feed that and I ask myself, which one of these are a problem, right? So that's fishbone. That's helps you with root cause analysis. Oh, we didn't talk about use cases, and it's one of my favorite things to use. If I'm doing a simple change, I won't do use cases. But if my change is complex at all, I'm going to do a use case. Because user stories are great from the perspective of a single user, but they often overlap, and user stories can become a bit repetitive because you'll have multiple user types that need the same kind of thing. The other thing is you could have a function that requires a lot of different elements, which means different user stories. Well, how do they all fit together? When you're working with a complex thing, use cases are very, very appropriate. And these blend beautifully with these because you'll build a screen prototype and then you'll describe the user's experience in how they will interact with that screen and all the different ways they might interact with that screen. And you'll get more details on that later. You get that next weekend. But use cases I am a huge proponent of. And there are two things. There's a use case diagram where you do the big picture about what's involved in something. So we're talking about an ATM. These are all the different use cases, okay? And being going to a restaurant. This is what it would look like, right? And what are the different, and so these are all different use cases. And you'll learn a lot more about that later. But the use case itself is more about the steps describing the experience. I'll show you that another time. I'll show you that before we're done tomorrow, because we are actually at time, but I do still have a couple of things to talk to you about. And then sequence diagrams. This is CBAP only. These are very technical, very technical. And at its root, it's actually intended to be referencing of code, because it's very object oriented, and it talks about messages and system messages and see this, C log on, M log on. These are referencing objects in a system, and these are referencing actual methods and calls. You can use this at a higher level to show a use case, but honestly, to show a use case, I would not use sequence diagram. I would use, and this is very likely in your test, I use activity diagrams, which look like this. It's a lot easier to read for a user. Because to model out a use case diagram, you're going to want business people to look at it. And if you try to put a sequence diagram in front of a business user, they're going to just blank stare you. They're not going to understand what they're looking at. We talked about state modeling. I don't know if I showed you a state transition. Oops. That's not what I was looking for. State transition diagram. And this is where I can go from this state to this state or these states, and it shows you the different states that something can go through. Okay. And there are different notations. Data mining and concept modeling. We didn't talk about that. Concept modeling. Here, I'll show you. Here's your Babok core concept model. This is a concept model. What it does is it takes like your high-level glossary terms and shows how they relate to one another. Often these core concepts turn into your glossary terms, which eventually turn into your entities in your data dictionaries that you then model. But a core concept is a really high-level diagram, mostly meant for executives and direction maintenance, right? Keep us all thinking about the right stuff. So that's concept modeling. Data mining is used a lot with market analysis and benchmarking and KPIs, where we're pulling data out of various sources, putting it together and trying to make sense of it. It's really a lot about data analytics, but mining data from multiple places to get an understanding of it. We did not cover balanced scorecard. Balanced scorecard is purely strategic. It's usually used along with SWOT. Balanced scorecard is about not just measuring your technology success or your financial success, but it's more about holistic health of an organization. So at the highest level, you'll have a vision and strategy, and then you'll say, okay, based on who we are, what is our health financially? And that's where you start having objectives. What KPIs help us measure those objectives? What are the targets and what are the initiatives we're using to improve our KPIs? And it's about measuring how healthy are you monetarily, process-wise, how happy are our customers, how fulfilled are they, and are we growing and learning as an organization, both for individuals as well as innovation in the organization. So most organizations measure their health by which one of these? Can someone take a guess?
All of this.
No, most organizations that I've ever worked with I never hear them talk. I hear them talk about one of them. What was that?
Financial.
Yeah.
Financial.
What's our profit margin? What does our P&L look like? That's how they determine, are they okay? And that's a very, very important metric, very important. But if we don't give attention to these other three, eventually this will fail. So this is what a balanced scorecard forces us to consider. It helps us realize that the health of an organization is not just about my P&L. It's about all four aspects. And if you've been in if every organization you've been in has all of these, then you are so lucky, because I have yet to work in one, and I've worked at some Fortune companies and I've never heard them talk balanced scorecard. Oh wait, one of them did. One of them talked about balanced scorecard. The others did not. So we talked about balanced scorecard. A business case. I didn't show you what a business case often looks like. A business case kind of gives you information about, it basically wraps up your strategy analysis. It says, this is the whole purpose of what we're trying to do. This is where we are today. This is where we hope to go. This is what would have to be changed in order to get to that future state. These are the solution options we considered. This is the one that we recommend and why. This is what it would look like if we were to implement that at a high level. That's what a business case looks like. Okay. We looked at business model canvas. We talked about decision analysis, even showed you a few things. Financial analysis is all about ROI, net present value, net benefit, stuff like that. It's just measuring the value of a process or a solution in financial terms. Risk analysis is where we understand or identify the risks. How possible, how likely are they? What would their impact be? What do we want to do about it? We already talked about SWOT. That was a lot. Okay, before I let you go, I want to show you a couple of things to help you study in the BABOK. In your presentations that are available on Succeed, you will get some summary slides, and you'll see those tomorrow. And they're very helpful, but they're not very visual. At the beginning of each knowledge area, it gives you this. When I was studying for my exam, I memorized these. Okay, I memorized the knowledge areas and their tasks. And for the knowledge areas, I memorized their input and output. Now, this goes further. For every task, so you'll want to know this at a big picture level because it'll help you. Some of the memorization, Rajeep, I don't want to say that. I got a question about which company talked about balanced scorecard. If I tell you that, then you're going to know the weaknesses of all the others. If you go on my LinkedIn, sorry. So trying to remember this is recorded. Private conversation, I would tell you that. But so for every knowledge area, memorize this. For every task in the knowledge area, this can get overwhelming, I know. But if you look at these for every task, it's really going to help you, because the things that you can memorize, which is things like what are the knowledge areas and the tasks in the knowledge area. For each one of those tasks, what are the inputs and outputs? What are the guidelines and tools? It's going to make answering the harder questions so much easier if you don't have to try to think through all of this. So I do recommend that you memorize that. And every one of these tasks has one of those.
I'm sorry, can you please go over what you suggest we memorize again?
These right here. In your BABOK, you'll look at, there's a diagram, and it's called an input-output diagram for every one of the tasks in the knowledge areas. It'll have an input-output diagram. I would study those. Okay? These are really helpful. And also, for your specific test, those of you that are ECBA doesn't have to do this, but CCBA, on the ones that have, on the ones that have examples of, hold on, I'm trying to find, give me a second. Oh, here's this, I love this. This is it. Business value, customer value, how we're performing, and the risk. This is my favorite approach to capability mapping. But that's not what I need to show you. Okay, here's an example. Those of you with CCBA and CBAP, you will need to recognize the difference between Gain-Sarzen and Jordan notation. You need to be able to know how to read these. And your test might give you a scenario and then show you a context diagram, and based on the combination of the scenario and context diagram, give you a list of possible requirements that could have been extracted, and you'll have to figure out which one of those is a requirement that would be extracted based on the situation. Those are the kind of things. You're going to want to look at any of the techniques in the Babok that give you specific examples. You're going to want to know what are, like they use crow's foot for ERDs, and then they list this for class diagram. You will likely get questions on that, and you'll need to understand the difference. You'll get a lot more training, those of you CCBA and CBAP, on this stuff later. So those are the things I would consider in your Babok. So I would probably use the input-output diagrams in the Babok because they're visual, and I work better with visual, to be honest. And I would start reading ahead, and I would start working with those administrative, for those of you, if you want a little refresher. Hold on just one second. Where did I put that? Apologies, I'm trying to find it. Nope. There it is. Okay. So for all of you, go to your study guides. Find your study guide and read the knowledge areas that we're about to cover. Okay. I would realize the presentations. One of you asked about that. They're in here under presentations. You can watch some little videos. They're not of class. They're just like they're little videos that have been made. I would start also looking at the flashcards once you've read your for the knowledge area that you're ready. Start doing your flashcards. And do these flashcards before you start hitting your question banks. And use, in that study guide, use that tool that I showed you to plan out your study path and start looking at that ASAP. Caleb asked a question that I didn't get to. Is there a resource that provides good examples of proper model form? It's often difficult to determine if I'm illustrating, communicating correctly. Business Process Modeling 2.0, if you're talking about business process modeling, there is a specific notation associated with that, and there's an accurate use of it. And that is, you can find that if you're trying to do international standard on process modeling. What's the organization's name? Yeah, bpmen.org. It's that simple. This is where you'll find all the rules you're supposed to follow. It gives you the guides. So there's that link. With things like use cases and things like that, there are multiple ways to approach it, and there's not one standard, which is unfortunate. User stories have multiple different approaches to acceptance and evaluation criteria. Some use Gherkin syntax, some just write requirements. So a lot of them don't have specific notations to ensure that you're using them correctly. Again, you just saw with some of that data modeling, the Gain-Sarzen versus Jordan, the ERD versus class. So there are different ways to do that. Now, ERD and class, ERD has multiple ways. I use crow's foot. But most of those, as long as you understand how to read a data model, you're going to be okay. Any questions that I haven't seen in chat so far? Okay, I know I threw this last hour and 20 minutes, I threw a ton of information at you. I get it. It can be a little overwhelming. I'm just hoping to give you a high level idea. So the ones that I can show you pictures and visuals, I'm showing you. Hopefully some of the information I gave you about how to work through the Succeed platform and how to prepare yourself for tomorrow and next weekend. Hopefully that helps. Tomorrow we cover 2 knowledge areas, and I'll give a lot. I expect when I cover requirements analysis and design and strategy analysis, I have a ton of examples that I use. So hopefully I'll be able to come up with similar examples to help you relate to it. And if I don't, call me out and make sure that I do. I'll do my best. I appreciate your time. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Okay. Anshika, would you mind connecting with me on LinkedIn and asking me that question there? That way I can, because you sent it to me privately and I would expect you want an answer private. So if you would connect with me on LinkedIn, that would be great.
Sure, Lauren, that would be great. Thank you.
You bet. And so again, for those of you that may not have seen it, I'm not hard to find on LinkedIn. You just look up Laura McCoy CBAP and I'm usually the first hit. So if you have questions you're not comfortable asking in this forum, message me and I'll do my best to answer before tomorrow.
Hey Laura, this is Caleb. I've got one other question.
You bet.
Kind of a sidebar. I was wondering, I know you talked about having an engineering background in software development. Would you mind having like a sidebar conversation or follow-up meeting about kind of explaining what your thoughts are on the technical versus non-technical business analysis? And I just have a number of questions on that. I guess I find it interesting, especially you having a software background, a development background, and then moving into business analysis.
Yeah, and keep in mind, I didn't do that for a living. I made straight A's in school, and I did not. I mean, I like creating stuff from scratch. That's kind of a cool feeling, but I'm not a coder. Technical versus non-technical. I've been a technical BA most of my life. I mean, so to be considered a business analysis professional, you have to be technically savvy. Otherwise, you're going to be more of a CCBA or ECBA and focus in the process realm, right? But the majority of change in our world involves tech. And so you don't have to be able to code, and you don't have to, you don't have to be an implementation SME. You don't have to be a techie, but you have to understand it just enough to be able to translate those needs into requirements. Now, if you want the opportunity of breadth and the opportunity to get into more like the technology side is often going to be higher compensation, right? So ideally you build some of those technical skill sets. If you want to get CBAP, you're going to have to be technical because it's going to give you ERDs. It's going to give you sequence diagrams. It's going to give you technical documentation that you have to understand and extract requirements from. A business analyst, in my mind, should be capable of, when you're younger, it's usually one of two things. It's usually process focused and it's micro, or it's technology focused and micro. Meaning, I already know what we're going to do big picture. I already know what our product roadmap is. I need you, business analyst that's a little younger, I need you to focus on just this screen, right? You don't have to worry about anything else, just this screen. But when you get, which means you need to understand the idea of user experience, appropriate spatial placement of fields and order, and you'd be able to think like a user, but still be able to put together a design with an ERD and a screen that's useful for your developers and DBA guys, right? Or girls, whatever. So technical versus non-technical, by the time you're an expert business analyst, you usually can dive into the technical. If you're a younger business analyst, you might be a little less so, unless you're just going to be a process engineer, if that makes sense. I don't know if I answered that question.
That makes sense. I appreciate it.
Do you have any other questions that might help the whole group? Because I would expect that that question would be applicable to a few people on the line.
Yeah, this isn't necessarily along the same lines, but I'm kind of interested to see who we will be communicating with all these models. I know in my line of work, I typically try to keep them super simple just because of the people I'm communicating with. They don't necessarily have a high level of technical experience. So if I start getting into the nitty gritty really fast, then I just lose them.
Yeah, you're going to learn more about that next weekend.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So that's called, in our world, in the Babok world, it's called layers of abstraction. So you can show a data model to someone, but you're probably wanting to keep it really high level without a lot of detail to make sure, hey, I understand that your customer can have more than one policy and a policy can have more than one claim, right? Okay, great. Awesome. Right. But then when you give it to the developer, you're going to add the detail of all the data elements in there, not just the high level stuff. So you'll probably, data modeling, starts at a concept level, which is level 0, and then it goes to level 1, which is a logical data model. And then you've got level 2, which is physical. You as an analyst would share level 0 with business people and leaders, and you would share level 1 with more technical users and your developers and DBAs. So that's called layers of abstraction. And if you build your requirements right, you can do that kind of abstraction with many of the techniques, right? Like requirements, you have layers of abstraction. Business requirements go to executives and everyone else. Your user requirements focus on middle level users down. Your detailed functional requirements are usually for the people that have to interact with the system or build the system, right? So it's what layer of detail do you share with someone. I would never show a sequence diagram to a business person. I would show business models to all of them. And if my developers don't want to see that, I question that they're actually going to give good input on the solution, maybe that answers that. You're going to learn a lot more about that next weekend.
Got it. Thank you.
You bet. Any other questions? A BA and a PSM, a professional Scrum Master, is a lot more about Scrum mastering is a lot more about facilitation and project management. It's not necessarily about the requirements. If the Scrum Master is also behaving in the capacity of driving out requirements and challenging the group to think about things, now they're being both a Scrum Master and a business analyst. Same thing with project management. Project management is very structured, and it's about ensuring that risk and time and money and tasks and all of that is on board. Usually they do that when they have some kind of defined parameters already handed to them. Business analysis is where you dig into the unknowns, you drive out the need, you challenge the thinking, you help the group figure out where they need to go with it. So a professional Scrum Master is more of a blend. It's almost like a variation of project management, and they dabble in the area of facilitating Scrum meetings. But when you start driving out requirements, now you're being a business analyst. Some Scrum teams have a defined business analyst. Some Scrum teams don't. If there's not a business analyst in the Scrum team, the Scrum Master will often kind of operate in that capacity. A product owner is a blend of business analysis and project management, in case you were going to ask that next. Any other questions? Yes, a business analyst can evolve to a PO. PO can evolve to a PM, and I don't mean project manager. I mean product manager. A business analyst is often operating in the capacity of a product owner if they're in an environment that doesn't have those. A business analyst and a product owner are often very similar. Now, here's the biggest difference between a BA and a PO. A product owner focuses and specializes on a specific product. So really, a product owner is a bit of a siloed BA. I could never be a product owner. I can't. I want to be more objective. I want to be more strategic. I want to be bigger thinking. And I'm not very good at being given structured parameter that I have to live in. I don't respond very well to that. So a product owner is a business analyst that focuses, essentially. They're a business analyst that focuses on a specific product and its roadmap. A business analyst, if you have a product owner, you really need a business analyst working with that product owner, because the business analyst, if it's being leveraged correctly, if a business analyst is being leveraged correctly, they ensure that whatever that product owner is driving fits into the bigger scheme of things and falls in line with strategy. Okay. And helps that product owner see things from multiple perspectives. Product management is when you take a product owner and you start putting them in more of a leadership role, and a product owner focuses on the micro of a product. Product managers do market analysis, they do competitive analysis, they do studies, and then they drive that down to the PO who drives the product. I prefer being the professional generalist. Is a process owner the same as a domain SME? Basically, yes. Any other questions? These are really, really good questions, guys. I don't often get these kind of questions. This is good. Okay, so I'm gonna set you free. We've been on here for an hour and a half now. I've got you half an hour over. Warned you. Sorry. I will see you tomorrow. Kind of think about this.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have one more question.
You bet.
It's about the workbook, really. It's not really about what we just went through. I actually downloaded the workbook, and one of the suggestions when we did the introduction to the course was to print it out and take notes as we go. However, I'm noticing that it's not in order as to how we're going. Is it created that way on purpose, or did I print out the wrong thing, or?
No, hold on. Are you talking about the study guide?
Yes. So under the study guide, you will see. Not the Excel sheet. Hold on, let me go back to mine and see. Okay, under that reference material, you will see this analysis workbook.
Okay, so where are we looking?
Go back to the home screen. Yeah, under reference materials, business analysis workbook 205.
This?
Right there, yeah.
I don't know if I've ever seen this. Hold on.
Okay.
No, it is following along. I think the only difference here is I didn't cover these in this order because it doesn't make sense to me.
Okay.
It doesn't flow well. So I jumped around on techniques. I covered techniques in the order that you would typically cover them when you do actual work. So I'm trying to blend a little bit of real world in with this, because if I just go down the list, you won't see how they connect together the same. So that's what I was trying to do. So when I probably did make you have to jump around a little bit.
Right. Okay. Would you also mind sharing your podcast again?
I'll find them and have them ready to share with you tomorrow. I'll have them open. I've got two or three. I can't remember how many.
Okay, thank you so much.
You bet. Yep. Thanks, guys. I'll see you tomorrow. Prepare your questions in case you have them, and we'll cover those first.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. Have a great day, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah.